No more narcissistic corruption, relieving the scapegoat's burden. Have you felt like you do not stand up for your core principles? Is it difficult to feel like you deserve to be proud of yourself? Do you somehow feel dishonorable, yet find it hard to know why? Well, all children must convince themselves that they have a parent who loves them. In the case of a good enough family, this is not hard to do. The parent provides the child with daily evidence that they have a loving parent. Such children don't have to distort themselves to feel cared for. In contrast, the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent must attach to someone who essentially rejects them. The child has to make sense of this rejection to make it seem okay. They can do this by adopting the belief that they are bad, defective, and/or undeserving. Now, the narcissistic parent's treatment of them actually feels justified. The scapegoat child can still see the parent now as a viable caregiver. Importantly, the scapegoat child has no choice in this matter. Survival dictates the child believe in their parent, so whatever the child does to maintain this belief is essentially something they're being forced to do. The scapegoat survivor may feel corrupted by the sacrifices they had to make in order to feel cared for. To be corrupt is to show a willingness to act dishonestly in return for personal gain. The concept of corruption requires that the corrupted person has a choice in the matter. Instead of acting honestly, they choose to act dishonestly for personal gain. Well, personal gain differs from survival. As organisms, we're hardwired to survive. Whenever something interferes with this mission, we do everything possible to surmount it. The scapegoat child may confuse their adaptations to survive for corrupt choices they made or had to make. In today's video, I show why the scapegoat child was not the corrupt person in the narcissistic family. Next, I discuss what life may feel like for the scapegoat child and survivor who believe they are corrupt. Third, I'm going to suggest a process of healing from feeling corrupted in order to enjoy a much-deserved sense of your own honor and integrity. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. It's in my professional and personal experience that I've worked to identify the fundamentals to the process of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance from narcissistic abusers and closeness to safe people. Pillar number 3 is to live in defiance of the narcissist rules. It's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. I've both seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after applying these pillars. Today's video falls under pillar number 1, making sense of what happened. Well, if you were a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or partner, then I encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoat child or partner of a narcissistic abuser. From self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you must adopt in order to survive, to why the narcissistic personality is so geared to put the people closest to them down. I think and hope that this ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems. And you can find the link to the book in the description box below or by clicking here. And last, if you find this content helpful, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. And you can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok under @JReedTherapy or on Facebook under JReed Psychotherapy. And these links are all in the description box below. The narcissistic parent's corrupt ways. The scapegoat child is thrust into the role of villain by the narcissistic parent. The parent treats the child like an enemy. In order for the child to feel like somebody to this parent, they must then think and act like the enemy. An enemy to the parent, an enemy to other family members, and even an enemy to themselves. Being the enemy of the narcissistic parent actually spares the child the more annihilating experience of having to be nobody to no one. All of this is a profound act of dishonesty by the narcissistic parent. They are consumed by the fear of their own worthlessness and will do anything to deny it. What they end up doing, though, is projecting their own sense of worthlessness onto or into the scapegoat child. Next, they insist the child see and think of themselves as worthless. An effective way to do this is to treat the child like an enemy, with the parent's dreaded feelings cast out of themselves and now embodied in the scapegoat child. The narcissistic parent feels protected. The parent is now more free to believe they are not worth less, but actually worth more than others. This entire psychological process is dishonest. The narcissistic parent refuses to acknowledge the truth that they are the ones who feel worthless. Instead, they lie to themselves about who is the worthless one. Since they have more authority and power over the child, they can force the child to go along with it. So the narcissistic parent gains protection from feeling worthless and a sense of superiority. They show a willingness to act dishonestly for these personal gains. This is the very definition of corruption. So let's look at another anonymized case example to illustrate this. Paul had a narcissistic father who went out of his way to blame and put Paul down at every turn. Paul came to therapy in his late 20s because he found himself shying away from success in his life. In the early sessions, we grew to understand how hostile Paul had grown towards himself. He would readily discredit his attributes or accomplishments, and this hostility towards himself seemed to mirror his father's hostility towards him as a child. Paul recounted being devalued and humiliated whenever he came into his father's attentional sphere. He had no choice but to view himself the same way if he wanted to share a reality with this man. Well, one of the painful results of this treatment was Paul's having to view himself as a corrupt person. He recalled a time in 8th grade when he asked himself whether he'd rather like himself if it meant being disliked by his classmates, or be liked by his classmates if it meant him disliking himself. He knew his answer would be the latter, that he would prefer to be liked by his classmates even if it meant disliking himself. This inner dialogue led to him concluding that he was willing to act dishonestly by disliking himself if it meant getting the personal gain of being liked by his classmates. He then had to live with the conclusion that he was corrupt and the feelings that accompanied that. Well, Paul's conversation with himself in the 8th grade omitted some really important factors. First, his father was acting with dishonesty in his abuse of Paul. His father's claims that Paul was worthless instead of himself were inherently dishonest. However, Paul was forbidden from knowing this at the time because he needed to preserve the relationship to his father. Second, his father also would have been the one who thought it more important to be liked than to like himself. His father's entire world was premised on substituting others' positive views of him for his own negative views of himself. Third, the question itself reflected the abusive situation Paul was in with his father. Paul had learned that in his life he could either like himself or be liked by others. He could not imagine at the time being entitled to both. And this was a direct extrapolation of his relationship with his father. To be liked by this man, Paul had to dislike himself. If Paul liked himself, then his father would intensely dislike him. So upon further examination, Paul's claim to his own corruption did not hold up. The scapegoat child's adaptations that get confused for corruption. The scapegoat child has to take on the role of enemy to the parent or else. If they do not, then they risk something unsurvivable. As I said, being nobody to no one. Under this threat, everything they do is based on their survival. So the scapegoat child has no choice in the matter. Choice requires that one will survive if one says yes or if they say no. The child will not survive if they say no to the narcissistic parent's psychological demands, so therefore they are forced to say yes. In the course of having to say yes or sort of comply with the narcissistic parent's dishonesty, the scapegoat child can feel corrupted. Survival requires that they think, feel, and act like they are worthless while staying close to the narcissistic parent. The parent needs the scapegoat child close to them in order for the parent to feel expunged of their own worthlessness. So the scapegoat child may conclude that they are choosing to stay close to someone who rejects them. In order to make this supposed choice, the child has to be dishonest about how hurt they feel by this parent. They have to excuse the parent's cruelty towards them as justified and keep seeking that parent's favor. The child may misattribute their behavior to their own lack of integrity, that they're willing to betray themselves in order to be liked by this parent, that they have somehow sold themselves out for the gain of acceptance from someone who's mean to them. Well, the scapegoat child can end up feeling like the corrupt one by concluding that they are making the choice to be dishonest about how unfairly treated they feel for the supposed gain of being accepted by the same person who is mistreating them. The scapegoat child has the misbegotten notion of their own corruption, which can lead many scapegoat survivors to wish they had sort of stood up for themselves or not let their parent get away with treating them this way. I think these sentiments are very understandable efforts to correct the feeling that they are corrupted, retrieve a sense of their own integrity, of their own character. Well, someone who is truly corrupt is not bothered by the fact of their dishonesty. A narcissistic parent who is confronted by a scapegoat survivor will often not see themselves as having done anything wrong. To them, being dishonest is nothing to be ashamed of. They have other priorities, mainly not seeing themselves as worthless. Interestingly, scapegoat survivors are often extremely upset by the notion that they are corrupt or feel corrupt. They want to live in an emotionally honest world, so the accusation that they have lived dishonestly for personal gain is deeply troubling. I think the good news for survivors is that this accusation has never been true, even if it has felt true. To exonerate themselves from feeling corrupt, the scapegoat survivor must recognize how they never had a choice in all of this. They had to manage the biological necessity of being someone to their narcissistic parent, along with the parent's requirement that they act dishonestly. Since biology dictates that we do whatever it takes to survive as children, they really had no other choice. I've yet to find an account of a young child who chose to be on their own instead of seek connection with an abusive parent. Yet many survivors see themselves as being corrupt or even weak for not having made such a choice. Well, if the scapegoat survivor can accept the fact that they didn't have a choice in being dishonest about their pain, then it can then make no sense to call themselves corrupt. Because being corrupt requires a willingness to be dishonest, and this presumes the presence of free will for the corrupted person. And the child, of course, was not free to exercise their will. So the only person who should stand accused of corruption is the narcissistic parent. As an adult, they fundamentally had more options than the child. They may have feared taking accountability for their own sense of worthlessness, but they were still response-able, response-able. Objectively stated, they could survive such an ordeal. Instead, the argument can be made that they chose to act dishonestly at the child's expense for their own personal gain. The point of this is not to play the blame game, but to put the corruption where it belongs. A strategy to shed the familiar but inaccurate sense of being corrupted. A wise colleague once told me that just because something is familiar and uncomfortable does not make it true. She then said that just because something is unfamiliar and comfortable does not make it untrue. Well, the rapper DMX puts it another way. In so many words, he says, "Forget what you heard, it's what you're hearing." I think this wisdom from both sources applies to the process of healing from narcissistic abuse time and again. In order to accept the unfamiliar fact that you did not have a choice in how you adapted to survive your narcissistic parent's abuse, I think you need distance from narcissistic people in your life today. Psychological, emotional, and even physical distance can be needed to know it's safe to reconsider these long-held assumptions about being the corrupt one. If current relationships are dictated by the same abusive terms as before, then it likely won't feel safe to see the other as corrupt instead of yourself. And by other, in this case, I'm thinking of the narcissistic parent. Well, one must also participate in safe, ongoing relationships today. A scapegoat survivor may initially find it hard to make use of such resources. Being close to someone has meant taking all the blame for so long that feeling safe while being close may seem impossible. Despite this, one can and does often feel incrementally safer when participating in such relationships over time. So you might consider talking to a safe person in your life about any feelings of corruptions you have. Such a safe person will likely treat your disclosure as a privilege. They will give you and what you're telling them the respect that you both deserve. By talking through how you may have mistook yourself to be corrupt rather than your narcissistic parent, you may get to have a different experience. You could find evidence that it is now safe to know and tell the truth, or in essence, be honest in these ways without the loss of a needed relationship. I think there's an important difference between reading or watching information on one's own versus having new experience in current safe relationships. The painful beliefs that you're corrupt, defective, and or undeserving were come by in an important relationship to the narcissistic parent. I think in order to disconfirm these beliefs, new experience has to happen in an important and safe relationship. We're wired this way. It's difficult, if not impossible, to trust that these beliefs are safe to relinquish just in the privacy of one's own mind. Not to say that the learning and education about this topic isn't useful, but it's, I think, very important to couple that with actual, real experience in such new and safe relationships. As daunting as getting close to someone may feel, it is ultimately what will be healing. So let's go back to Paul. He worked in therapy over several years. Together, we noted that the idea that he had integrity seemed to be what was dishonest to them. He had so much practice in thinking of himself as weak-willed and not having integrity that such a notion seemed impossible to him. Paul worked in several ways to test whether his therapist needed him to be dishonest in order to like him. Here's one of his tests. First, his therapist tended to be a few minutes late to sessions. This roiled Paul inside. He'd feel disrespected and fearful of confronting his therapist about this. He assumed his therapist would turn it on him and ask him why he was so sensitive to such a small mistake. Maybe Paul expected perfection from others and that they should really work on this. These possibilities felt nauseating to Paul. Aside from all this, Paul liked his therapist. He felt understood, his therapist seemed to be on his side, and his therapist was consistently kind to him. But after a few months, Paul decided it was time to share his feelings about his therapist's lateness. When his therapist came to the session about 3 minutes late, Paul said, "I don't like it when you're late," and he was feeling a ton of tension and anxiety in this moment. His therapist nodded and said, "Yeah? Tell me, I want to hear more." Paul replied, "Well, when you're late, it feels like you think your time is more valuable than mine. I end up feeling disrespected and I don't like it." His therapist said, "I bet you don't. I have been late, a lot. You're right. And you're rightfully angry about it." Paul felt some relief and said, "Yeah, but I'm also a little scared to be telling you this. Like I'm worried I'll hurt your feelings or I'm going to anger you into attacking me." His therapist said, "That makes a lot of sense, too. It sounds like you expect me to take no accountability for how I failed your reasonable expectations, that I'll either wither from your supposed attack or retaliate against you. In either case, I won't care about the truth that you're expressing, that I am and have been late a lot. It may be hard to imagine that I would care about honesty, even when doing so means admitting that I have come up short." Paul said, "Yeah, it sure is. I mean, that was never a possibility growing up. Nobody besides me ever took responsibility for their shortcomings. It seemed like I was the only one who had them. Well, this exchange and others like it helped Paul gain experience in this safe relationship where honesty and closeness could coexist. Over time, Paul could appreciate how false his feelings of being corrupt all this time were. And he could clearly see how the corruption started and persisted with his father's core dishonesty. Well, if you've had to live with this feeling of I often think of it as sort of having spoiled milk inside, pretty awful. But it can go along with this feeling of having to identify as being corrupt, when in fact the corruption is all around you. But that can be the life one has to live as a scapegoat child, and even later as a scapegoat survivor. And I hope today's video helps to shed some light through this dynamic, and hopefully over time can be part of what empowers survivors to shed this label of being the corrupt person and kind of put it where it belongs. Thank you for tuning in today, and I hope again you found today's video useful. I want to thank you again for your continued support, appreciation for even ideas that challenge some of the content in these videos that are all put in the comments section, and of course the support offered one another. The community that's been here and that continues to show up, I think, each week. It's just, again, so heartening, given the healing, I think, mission that all the commenters seem to share. Okay, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.